Hey guys, tonight we begin with something darker than usual. The twisted, debauched, and morally questionable lives of medieval monarchs who turned absolute power into absolute corruption. We're diving into the shadowy side of royal history, where crowns came with more than just privilege, they came with the freedom to indulge every dark impulse. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval kingship wasn't just about wearing a crown and making royal decrees. It was about wielding absolute power over millions of lives, controlling vast treasuries, and living in a world where saying no to a king could mean death. For some rulers, this intoxicating combination of power and immunity created monsters. Tonight, we'll explore the most depraved royal figures of the medieval period, men whose appetites knew no bounds and whose cruelties became legend. But before we dive deep into these dark waters, we need to understand something crucial about the medieval world. This was a time when moral standards were vastly different from our own, when violence was commonplace, and when the concept of human rights simply didn't exist. What we're examining tonight isn't just individual depravity, but the inevitable result of absolute power, corrupting absolutely in a world with few constraints on royal behavior. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms where divine right ruled supreme. Kings weren't just political leaders, they were believed to be appointed by God himself. This divine mandate meant that questioning a king's behavior was tantamount to questioning God's will. The Church, while officially promoting Christian morality, often found itself complicit in royal excesses, as bishops and abbots owed their positions to royal appointment. In this world of absolute power, some rulers managed to maintain dignity and justice. Others, however, descended into depths of depravity that shocked even their callous contemporaries. The men we'll meet tonight represent the darkest possibilities of unchecked authority, showing us what happens when unlimited power meets unlimited appetite. The medieval court was a hothouse of intrigue, flattery, and moral compromise. Surrounded by nobles who depended on royal favor for their survival, these kings rarely heard the word no. Marriage was purely political, love was a luxury few could afford, and fidelity was expected only from queens, never from kings. This double standard gave male monarchs free rein to pursue whatever caught their fancy. Our first monarch ruled England from 1199 to 1216, during one of the most turbulent periods in medieval history. John Lackland, as he was mockingly called by his enemies, earned his place in infamy, not just for losing his French territories or signing Magna Carta under duress, but for a pattern of sexual predation that horrified even his violence-hardened contemporaries. Medieval chroniclers, usually careful to maintain some degree of royal dignity in their accounts, wrote unusually frank descriptions of John's behavior. Matthew Paris, one of the most reliable contemporary sources, claimed that John routinely seduced or coerced the wives and daughters of his nobles, creating a climate of fear and resentment throughout his kingdom that went far beyond normal political tensions. This wasn't mere philandering, which was expected and generally tolerated in medieval kings. John's behavior crossed lines that even his amoral age found shocking. He seemed to take particular pleasure in humiliating his nobles by forcing their women into his bed, then flaunting these conquests at court gatherings. The psychological damage he inflicted often proved more lasting than any physical violation. One of the most damaging incidents involved the wife of a Welsh prince during delicate peace negotiations. John had been working to secure the Welsh border when he became obsessed with the princess. According to Welsh chronicles, he demanded her as part of the diplomatic settlement, treating a living woman as if she were a piece of territory to be bartered. When her husband refused, John invaded Wales specifically to capture her. The princess was brought to his court, where she remained as his concubine for several months. Contemporary accounts describe her visible distress and growing despair as she realized her situation was permanent. She died within the year, reportedly from what medieval chroniclers euphemistically called grief, though modern historians suspect suicide. Her death created a blood feud with Wales that would plague John for the rest of his reign. But John's appetites extended far beyond noble families. Medieval records mention several cases where abbesses complained directly to the Pope about John's unwanted advances toward nuns under their care. One particularly disturbing account describes John forcing his way into a convent and threatening the Mother Superior with violence unless she surrendered her youngest sisters to his pleasure. The systematic nature of John's predations suggests something more calculated than simple lust. He seemed to use sexual violence as a tool of political control, breaking the spirit of potential rebels by violating their most precious relationships. When he captured an enemy's castle, he would often demand the lord's female relatives as hostages, and everyone understood what that really meant. Perhaps most shocking was how openly John discussed his conquests. Unlike most medieval kings who maintained at least a pretense of discretion, John would make crude jokes about his latest victims at royal feasts, often in front of their husbands or fathers. This wasn't just abuse. It was calculated humiliation designed to break the will of men who might otherwise have opposed him. The psychological impact on John's victims was devastating. Several contemporary sources mention noble wives who retreated to convents after encounters with the king, claiming they could no longer bear the sight of men. Others reportedly never spoke again after returning from forced stays at court. The ripple effects of John's cruelty extended through entire families and communities. John's marriage to Isabella of Angoulême was itself a scandal that demonstrated his complete disregard for established custom. He literally stole her from her fiancé, Hugh of Lusignan, on their wedding day, disrupting not just two lives but an entire network of political alliances. This impulsive act created powerful enemies in France and contributed directly to John's eventual loss of his continental territories. Even within his own marriage, John's behavior remained problematic. Despite having a young and reportedly beautiful queen, he continued his predatory activities. Isabella lived in constant fear, watching how her husband treated other women and knowing that royal wives who displeased their husbands could face annulment, exile, or worse. The psychological pressure was so intense that she reportedly suffered from what contemporary physicians called melancholy, likely what we would now recognize as severe depression. The political consequences of John's sexual violence were as destructive as the personal toll on his victims. By 1215, John faced the largest baronial revolt in English history. While the rebels' public demands focused on legal reforms and taxation, private correspondence reveals that many nobles were driven primarily by fury over years of sexual humiliation and abuse. The famous Magna Carta gained much of its support from men who had personal reasons to hate their king. The document itself, while primarily concerned with legal and financial matters, contained subtle references to protecting subjects from arbitrary royal action. Many of these clauses took on deeper meaning when you understood what John's subjects had actually endured. The emphasis on due process and protection from capricious punishment reflected the lived experience of nobles who had watched their wives and daughters disappear into royal chambers. John's reign also established dangerous precedents for royal behavior that would influence English kingship for generations. His systematic use of sexual violence as a tool of governance, his complete disregard for marriage customs, and his willingness to violate church sanctuary all expanded the boundaries of what kings could do with impunity. Future monarchs would remember these lessons, sometimes choosing to follow his example. The king's death in 1216, possibly from poison administered by a monk who could no longer bear John's treatment of women in his monastery, was met with celebration throughout England. The relief was so profound that his 9-year-old son, Henry, was easily accepted as king, despite the chaos that usually followed child rulers. The regents governing for young Henry III immediately began implementing reforms specifically designed to prevent future kings from abusing their subjects as John had done. Yet John's legacy lived on in law and custom. Many of the legal protections enshrined in Magna Carta were specifically designed to prevent future kings from engaging in the kind of arbitrary cruelty that had marked John's reign. The document's emphasis on protecting subjects from royal caprice gained urgency from the desperate need to ensure that no future monarch could terrorize his people with the same systematic brutality. Moving forward in English history, we encounter Edward II, whose reign from 1307 to 1327 became a cautionary tale about the intersection of personal obsession and political power. While Edward's particular desires were different from John's predatory behavior, they proved equally destructive to the kingdom and ultimately to himself. Edward inherited the throne from his formidable father, Edward Longshanks, who had conquered Wales and terrorized Scotland. The contrast between father and son couldn't have been more stark. Where Edward I had been a warrior king who lived for battle and conquest, Edward II preferred the company of beautiful young men to the rigors of medieval warfare. This preference might have remained a private matter in a more tolerant age, but in 14th century Europe, it became a source of scandal that undermined his entire reign. The trouble began almost immediately after Edward's coronation with his relationship to Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight of modest birth who had somehow captured the new king's complete devotion. Their bond was so intense and so openly displayed that it shocked even the relatively cosmopolitan English court. Medieval chronicles, written in careful Latin euphemisms, described their relationship as going far beyond normal male friendship. Edward's behavior toward Gaveston revealed a man completely unable to separate personal desire from royal duty. He showered his favorite with titles, lands, and treasure on a scale that would have been inappropriate even for a close relative. Making Gaveston Earl of Cornwall, one of England's most prestigious titles, was seen as a direct insult to every English noble family that had served the crown for generations. More shocking still, Edward allowed Gaveston to carry the crown and royal regalia at his own coronation, an honor that should have gone to the highest-ranking peer in the realm. Contemporary accounts describe the two men sharing beds, exchanging kisses in public, and speaking to each other with endearments usually reserved for married couples. Edward gave Gaveston pet names, calling him his dearest brother, though everyone understood that their relationship was far from fraternal. The king seemed intoxicated by his feelings, completely indifferent to the political damage his open affection was causing. The English nobility's reaction went beyond simple homophobia, though that certainly played a role. They were witnessing what appeared to be a foreign adventurer exercising undue influence over their king through sexual manipulation. Gaveston's arrogant behavior at court, his obvious contempt for English customs, and his apparent belief that royal favor made him untouchable created enemies throughout the kingdom. But Edward seemed blind to these concerns. When his nobles demanded Gaveston's exile, the king's resistance was so passionate that it bordered on the irrational. He would weep openly at council meetings when discussing separation from his favorite, apparently unable to comprehend why anyone would object to his private happiness. This emotional volatility made effective governance impossible. The first exile of Gaveston in 1308 lasted only a year before Edward recalled him, despite having sworn solemn oaths to keep the favorite away permanently. This breach of trust destroyed whatever credibility Edward had retained with his nobility. It also demonstrated that the king's attachment to Gaveston was stronger than any political consideration, including the stability of his own throne. When Gaveston was captured and executed by rebellious barons in 1312, Edward's grief was so profound that witnesses described him as temporarily insane. He wept uncontrollably for days, refused to eat, and swore elaborate oaths of vengeance against every man involved in his favorite's death. The king's inability to function during this crisis left England effectively rudderless during a crucial period. But Edward's story didn't end with Gaveston's death. Within a few years, he had found a new favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. If anything, this second relationship was even more problematic than the first. Despenser was already married with children, yet he moved into the royal household and began sharing the king's bed with little attempt at discretion. Unlike Gaveston, who had been merely greedy, Despenser was actively malicious. Despenser used his influence over Edward to persecute enemies, seize their lands, and accumulate power that rivaled the king's own. He was particularly cruel to Edward's wife, Queen Isabella, whom he seemed to view as a rival for the king's affections. Isabella found herself increasingly marginalized at her own court, treated with contempt by her husband's lover, while Edward looked on with apparent approval. The relationship with Despenser revealed the depths of Edward's emotional dependence on his male favorites. He seemed incapable of making any important decision without consulting his lover first, effectively giving Despenser veto power over royal policy. This arrangement might have been merely embarrassing in a competent ruler, but Edward's political judgment was so poor that Despenser's malicious advice often made bad situations worse. Isabella's transformation from neglected wife to vengeful queen illustrates the broader consequences of Edward's personal obsessions. Intelligent, politically astute, and increasingly desperate, she began plotting rebellion against her own husband. Her affair with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English noble, was both personally liberating and politically strategic, giving her the military support she needed to challenge Edward's rule. The invasion Isabella launched in 1326 succeeded partly because Edward's government was so unpopular, but also because the king's emotional attachment to Despenser made him incapable of rational military planning. Instead of consolidating his forces or negotiating with the rebels, Edward fled with his favorite, apparently believing that as long as they were together, everything would somehow work out. Edward's final downfall was swift and complete. Despenser was captured and executed with horrific cruelty, suffering the full penalty for treason. The king himself was forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son, becoming the first English monarch to lose his throne not through military defeat or foreign invasion, but through complete loss of domestic support. But Edward's enemies weren't satisfied with mere abdication. As long as he lived, he remained a potential rallying point for supporters who might try to restore him. The solution was imprisonment in Berkeley Castle under the care of men chosen specifically for their brutality and lack of scruple. Edward's death in 1327 remains one of history's most disturbing mysteries. The official cause was given as natural illness, but persistent rumors claimed he was murdered in a way that served as brutal commentary on his alleged sexual practices. According to these accounts, his captors inserted a red-hot iron rod into his rectum, burning his internal organs while leaving no external marks of violence. Whether this gruesome tale represents historical fact or propaganda created by his enemies, it demonstrates how completely Edward's reputation had been destroyed by his personal obsessions. The king, who had once been hailed as the hope of English chivalry, died alone, abandoned even by most of his former lovers, a victim of his own inability to balance private desire with public duty. Edward II's reign serves as a stark reminder that medieval kingship demanded not just birth and breeding, but also political wisdom and emotional restraint. His story shows how even legitimate personal relationships could become destructive when pursued without regard for their broader consequences. In a world where royal behavior was always political, Edward's fatal flaw was believing that love could somehow exist separate from power. Crossing the English Channel to medieval France, we encounter Philip Augustus, who ruled from 1180 to 1223 and whose personal obsessions nearly overshadowed his considerable political achievements. While history remembers Philip as one of France's greatest medieval kings, his private life was marked by disturbing fixations that horrified even his relatively tolerant contemporaries. Philip's descent into obsessive behavior began with what should have been a routine political marriage to Isabella of Hainaut in 1180. The union was arranged to strengthen French claims to territories in the Low Countries, but Philip's reaction to his 13-year-old bride quickly became something far more troubling than normal royal affection. Medieval chroniclers noted that the 16-year-old king developed an intense physical obsession with Isabella that went far beyond anything considered appropriate for a political marriage. The young king's behavior toward his bride was so extreme that it disrupted the normal functioning of the French court. Philip could barely function when separated from Isabella, canceling important state meetings to spend time with her, ignoring foreign ambassadors who had traveled for weeks to see him, and reportedly throwing violent tantrums when court protocol required them to be apart. His advisors began to worry seriously about the kingdom's stability when the king's personal fixations took precedence over affairs of state. But Philip's feelings for Isabella had a possessive, almost pathological quality that went beyond intense love. Contemporary accounts suggest he became consumed by jealousy, refusing to allow Isabella to speak privately with any man, including her own relatives and established court officials. He stationed guards outside her chambers, not for protection, but to monitor her movements and report on her activities. The king's surveillance of his wife extended to having servants flogged for bringing her messages he hadn't personally approved, and questioning her ladies-in-waiting about every detail of her daily routine. This wasn't normal royal security. It was the behavior of a man who viewed his wife as a possession rather than a person. Isabella, still a child herself, found herself living in what amounted to a luxurious prison. When Isabella died in childbirth in 1190, giving birth to their son Louis, Philip's grief transformed into something even more disturbing. Rather than accepting her death as the natural consequence of medieval childbirth, he seemed to interpret it as a personal betrayal. He refused to allow her body to be prepared for burial according to custom, instead keeping her corpse in their shared chambers for nearly a week while he sat beside it, talking to her as if she were still alive. Court officials who witnessed Philip's behavior during this period described him as appearing to have lost touch with reality. He would hold conversations with Isabella's corpse, asking her questions and waiting for responses that never came. He brought her food and tried to feed her lifeless mouth, becoming agitated when she didn't eat. Only the intervention of church authorities, who threatened to declare him mentally incompetent to rule, finally convinced him to allow a proper funeral. Even after Isabella's burial, Philip's obsession continued in disturbing ways. He had her tomb opened repeatedly so he could look at her remains, and he insisted on sleeping in the same bed where she had died, claiming he could still feel her presence. Court physicians, working with limited medieval understanding of mental illness, tried various treatments including bloodletting and herbal remedies, but nothing seemed to break Philip's unhealthy fixation on his dead wife. Philip's second marriage in 1193 to Ingeborg of Denmark created an entirely different but equally disturbing scandal. The marriage ceremony itself seemed normal, but on the morning after their wedding night, Philip claimed to be so physically repulsed by his new bride that he could not bear to be in the same room with her, much less continue their marriage. The king's reaction to Ingeborg was so extreme and so immediate that many historians believe something traumatic occurred during their wedding night. Some contemporary sources hint that Philip's expectations, formed by his obsessive relationship with Isabella, led him to treat Ingeborg with shocking cruelty when she failed to measure up to his idealized memories of his first wife. Rather than attempting to work through whatever problems had emerged, Philip immediately sought to have his marriage annulled, claiming that divine displeasure had made their union impossible. But Ingeborg, showing remarkable courage for a medieval queen, refused to cooperate with the annulment proceedings. Instead of quietly retreating to a convent as many women in her situation would have done, she appealed directly to the Pope, claiming that her marriage was valid and that Philip was holding her prisoner against church law. What followed was a 20-year battle that became increasingly bizarre and internationally embarrassing. Philip imprisoned Ingeborg in various castles and convents throughout France, sometimes allowing her to live in relative comfort, sometimes subjecting her to conditions that resembled punishment more than royal exile. His treatment of her seemed to depend on his mood and on whatever pressure he was receiving from papal representatives. During Ingeborg's imprisonment, Philip went through the motions of having their marriage annulled by compliant French bishops and married a third wife, Agnes of Marania. But his relationship with Agnes revealed the same obsessive patterns that had marked his marriage to Isabella. He became so possessive of Agnes that he refused to let her travel anywhere without him, even to visit her own family members who lived within the French kingdom. When Agnes became pregnant, Philip's behavior became even more controlling. He reportedly had female servants taste all her food first, not out of reasonable concern for poison, but out of paranoid fear that someone might harm the child growing inside her. He insisted on being present during her medical examinations and flew into rages when court physicians suggested that pregnant women needed rest away from their husbands. The international pressure on Philip to recognize Ingeborg as his lawful wife intensified when Pope Innocent III placed all of France under interdict, essentially excommunicating the entire kingdom until the marriage situation was resolved. Churches were closed, sacraments were forbidden, and the dead couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. Yet Philip held out for years, apparently preferring to see his entire kingdom suffer spiritually rather than give up his control over his marital situation. Agnes of Marania died in 1201, possibly from the stress of living under Philip's suffocating and increasingly paranoid attention. Her death seemed to break something fundamental in the king's psyche. He finally agreed to take Ingeborg back as queen, but their relationship remained cold and formal for the rest of his reign. Philip had spent so many years treating her as an enemy that genuine reconciliation proved psychologically impossible for him. The most disturbing aspect of Philip's later years was how his obsessive tendencies extended to his relationship with his own children. He had genuinely loved his son Louis while the boy was young, but as Louis grew into an independent young man, Philip became increasingly controlling and suspicious of his heir's activities and relationships. Philip had his adult son's correspondence intercepted, his friends investigated, and his movements closely monitored by royal agents. He seemed unable to accept that Louis had thoughts, feelings, and desires independent of his father's will. When Louis attempted to assert normal princely independence, Philip reacted as if his son were betraying him personally rather than simply growing up. The psychological pressure Philip placed on Louis was so intense that court observers began to worry about the prince's health and mental state. Louis developed what contemporary physicians called melancholic symptoms, including difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, and periods of profound sadness that modern doctors would likely recognize as depression. When Louis died in 1226, just before Philip himself, many courtiers privately believed that the old king's possessive love had literally killed his heir. Philip Augustus's reign demonstrates how private obsessions could distort even the most successful medieval rulers. Despite his military victories over England and his administrative achievements in strengthening the French monarchy, his inability to form healthy personal relationships created decades of unnecessary suffering for everyone around him, from his wives to his children, to his subjects who suffered under papal interdict. The psychological patterns Philip displayed, his obsessive possessiveness, his inability to accept loss or rejection, and his willingness to harm others rather than examine his own behavior, created ripple effects that extended far beyond his personal relationships. His treatment of Ingeborg became a diplomatic crisis that damaged France's relationship with the papacy for generations, while his suffocating control over his son may have contributed to political instability that plagued the early years of Louis VIII's reign. Perhaps most significantly, Philip's behavior established precedents for how French kings could treat their wives and children that would influence the monarchy for centuries. His willingness to imprison a queen who displeased him, his use of church politics to justify personal cruelty, and his belief that royal prerogatives extended to complete control over family members all became part of the institutional memory of French kingship. Moving eastward to medieval Russia, we encounter perhaps the most psychologically disturbed ruler in European history, Ivan IV, known to posterity as Ivan the Terrible. Ruling from 1533 to 1584, though not achieving real power until his late teens, Ivan transformed the Russian throne from a seat of governance into a platform for sadistic experimentation that horrified even the violence-hardened medieval world. Ivan's transformation from promising young ruler to homicidal tyrant began with childhood trauma that would have challenged any person's psychological development. Crowned Tsar at just 3 years old after his father's sudden death, Ivan spent his formative years watching court nobles murder each other in brutal power struggles for control of the regency. The boy who should have been learning statecraft instead received a comprehensive education in betrayal, violence, and the arbitrary nature of power. By the time Ivan achieved real authority at 16, he had witnessed more political violence than most adults would see in several lifetimes. But rather than making him cautious or wise, these experiences seemed to convince him that cruelty was not just an acceptable tool of governance, but the only reliable method of maintaining control. His first independent acts as Tsar revealed a young man who had absorbed all the wrong lessons from his traumatic childhood. Ivan's early victims were court officials who had opposed his family during the regency struggles. Rather than simply dismissing them or stripping them of titles, Ivan began experimenting with elaborate methods of execution designed to maximize both physical suffering and psychological impact on witnesses. His preferred approach was having victims thrown to packs of hunting dogs while he watched from palace windows, apparently deriving genuine pleasure from their terror and agony. Contemporary accounts describe Ivan laughing and applauding as his enemies were torn apart by the animals, sometimes shouting encouragement to the dogs or commentary on the victim's attempts to escape. This wasn't simply the callousness of a medieval ruler ordering necessary executions. It was the behavior of someone who found entertainment in others' pain and death. But Ivan's cruelty extended far beyond political opponents. His treatment of women, particularly those from noble families, became legendary throughout Russia for its calculated sadism. Unlike other medieval rulers whose sexual violence seemed driven by lust or desire for dominance, Ivan appeared motivated primarily by an urge to cause psychological suffering to his victims and their families. He took particular pleasure in forcing noble fathers to watch as he violated their daughters, then having both victims and witnesses killed to prevent word of these atrocities from spreading beyond the immediate court circle. The psychological torture of making family members witness each other's degradation seemed as important to Ivan as the physical acts themselves. This pattern of behavior suggests something deeper than ordinary medieval brutality. Ivan appeared to understand instinctively how to break people's spirits by attacking the relationships they valued most. His violence was strategic in ways that went beyond simple intimidation, designed to destroy not just individual victims but entire family networks that might potentially oppose his rule. One of the most horrific examples of Ivan's systematic cruelty occurred in 1570, when he suspected the city of Novgorod of planning rebellion against his authority. Rather than investigating these suspicions through normal legal channels, Ivan decided to punish the entire population as an example to other potentially disloyal regions. His response was to lay siege to his own city and systematically torture and murder its inhabitants over the course of 5 weeks. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that challenged the boundaries of human imagination: entire families roasted alive over slow fires, children thrown to wild animals for the entertainment of Ivan's soldiers, and mass sexual assaults carried out as public spectacles, while Ivan himself observed from a throne set up in the city's main square. The Novgorod massacre wasn't simply military action or even conventional political repression. It was theatrical cruelty designed to break the psychological resistance of Ivan's entire empire. By demonstrating his willingness to destroy entire cities on mere suspicion of disloyalty, Ivan was sending a message that no one, nowhere, was safe from his reach. But perhaps even more disturbing than Ivan's public atrocities was his treatment of his own wives and family members. Medieval Russian custom allowed rulers to take multiple wives if previous marriages ended in death, and Ivan exploited this provision to its fullest extent. By most historical counts, he married 7 times, though several of these marriages lasted only weeks or months before the wives died under suspicious circumstances. Ivan's first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, seems to have been genuinely loved by the young Tsar, and her death in 1560 marked the beginning of his worst period of systematic cruelty. Convinced that Anastasia had been poisoned by court enemies, Ivan embarked on a reign of terror that targeted anyone who had ever opposed or criticized his beloved first wife, even for minor court infractions years earlier. The psychological impact of Anastasia's death on Ivan appears to have been catastrophic. Rather than mourning in normal fashion, he became convinced that enemies were everywhere, plotting against him and anyone he loved. This paranoia, combined with his already established taste for cruelty, created a feedback loop of violence that spiraled completely out of control. Ivan's subsequent wives suffered under the weight of his impossible expectations and violent possessiveness. He demanded complete emotional and physical devotion while simultaneously suspecting them of plotting against him with imaginary lovers or political conspirators. The psychological pressure was so intense that several wives reportedly developed what contemporary observers described as madness, becoming catatonic or engaging in self-destructive behavior. When evidence emerged of his 5th wife, Catherine Howard's premarital relationships, Ivan's reaction was so extreme that even his violence-hardened courtiers were shocked. Rather than simply having her executed, he created elaborate torture scenarios designed to extract confessions about every intimate detail of her past, then used this information to publicly humiliate her before her eventual death. The process of destroying Catherine Howard was deliberately drawn out over months, with Ivan apparently savoring each stage of her psychological breakdown. He forced her to write detailed accounts of her sexual experiences, then had these documents read aloud at court gatherings while she was present. The combination of public shame and constant fear of execution reduced her to a broken shell of her former self. Ivan's most infamous act of personal violence occurred in 1581 when he killed his own son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, during a fit of uncontrollable rage. The exact circumstances remain debated by historians, but most reliable accounts agree that the Tsar beat his pregnant daughter-in-law so severely that she miscarried, leading to a confrontation with his son that ended with Ivan striking the young man in the head with his iron-pointed staff. The prince died 3 days later from his injuries, leaving Ivan without a competent heir and the Russian succession in chaos. But rather than showing remorse for this ultimate act of family violence, Ivan seemed primarily concerned about the political implications of his son's death. He immediately began planning to marry again, apparently hoping to father another heir despite being in his 50s and increasingly frail. The death of Ivan Ivanovich seemed to accelerate Ivan's psychological deterioration. His final years were marked by periods of religious mania, alternating with episodes of uncontrolled violence that surpassed even his earlier atrocities. He would spend days in prayer and fasting, begging God's forgiveness for his sins, then emerge to commit new cruelties that exceeded anything he had done before. During these final years, Ivan's sexual behavior became increasingly bizarre and predatory. Unable to attract noble wives through normal marriage negotiations due to his reputation for wife-killing, he began maintaining what amounted to a harem of young women collected from across his empire. These women disappeared into special quarters of the Kremlin and were never seen again, leading to widespread speculation about torture chambers and murder rooms hidden within the palace complex. Court officials who survived Ivan's reign later described an atmosphere of constant terror, where no one, regardless of rank or service to the crown, could feel safe from the Tsar's arbitrary violence. Even his closest advisors and most loyal supporters lived in fear that some imagined slight or momentary displeasure might result in torture and death. The psychological techniques Ivan developed for controlling his court became part of his legacy to Russian governance. His use of unpredictable violence, his practice of destroying entire family networks to eliminate potential opposition, and his ability to make people complicit in atrocities through fear, all became standard tools of Russian statecraft that would influence the country's political culture for centuries. Ivan's death in 1584, reportedly while playing chess, brought immediate relief throughout the Russian Empire. But his impact on Russian society proved lasting. He had demonstrated that absolute power, when wielded by someone with genuine psychological disorders, could create systems of governance based entirely on terror and cruelty. The techniques of political control through systematic violence that Ivan pioneered would be studied and imitated by later Russian rulers, from Peter the Great through Stalin. His reign established the principle that Russian czars could engage in virtually any level of brutality against their own subjects without facing meaningful consequences. More broadly, Ivan the Terrible's life serves as history's most vivid example of how medieval kingship's combination of absolute power and divine sanction could create monsters when placed in the hands of psychologically disturbed individuals. His story demonstrates that unchecked authority doesn't merely corrupt, it can completely destroy the basic human capacity for empathy and moral reasoning. From the mountains and forests of medieval Wallachia emerges perhaps the most psychologically complex figure in our catalog of royal depravity, Vlad III, known to history as Vlad the Impaler and to legend as the inspiration for Count Dracula. Ruling Wallachia in 3 separate periods between 1456 and 1476, Vlad elevated systematic cruelty from a crude tool of statecraft into a sophisticated art form that horrified even the violence-tolerant 15th century. Vlad's transformation from promising young prince into history's most notorious sadist began with childhood experiences that would have challenged any person's psychological development. At age 11, he and his younger brother Radu were taken as hostages by the Ottoman Empire, part of a diplomatic arrangement designed to ensure their father's loyalty to the Sultan's regime. For 6 years, from 11 to 17, Vlad lived at the Ottoman court in Adrianople, where he received an education in both refined culture and systematic brutality. The Ottoman Empire was at its height of power and sophistication, but it was also a society where public executions were elaborate entertainment and where torture was considered an essential element of effective governance. Where most hostages either adapted to their captivity or were broken by it, Vlad seemed to absorb the lessons in political terror while nursing an unquenchable hatred for his captors. Contemporary accounts suggest that he spent his adolescent years studying Ottoman methods of psychological warfare, apparently planning to use these techniques against his enemies when he eventually returned to Wallachia. The young prince's exposure to Ottoman cruelty was systematic and comprehensive. He witnessed mass executions carried out with theatrical precision, observed torture sessions designed to extract both information and public submission, and learned how fear could be used as a more effective weapon than armies or gold. But unlike his brother Radu, who eventually converted to Islam and found acceptance within Ottoman society, Vlad remained psychologically resistant to his captors while absorbing their methods. This created a dangerous psychological combination: intimate knowledge of sophisticated cruelty techniques paired with burning resentment and a desire for revenge that would eventually consume not just his enemies, but his entire principality. When Vlad finally claimed the throne of Wallachia in 1456, his first acts revealed how completely his personality had been warped by his years of captivity and observation of Ottoman methods. Rather than simply executing political opponents in the conventional medieval fashion, he began experimenting with techniques designed to maximize both physical suffering and psychological impact on potential rebels. His preferred method, which gave him his historical nickname, was impalement, forcing a sharpened wooden stake through a victim's body in such a way that death came slowly over hours or even days. But Vlad's innovation lay not just in the technique itself, but in the scale and systematization of its application. Where previous rulers might impale a handful of enemies as examples, Vlad created entire forests of stakes surrounding his capital city. Contemporary accounts describe thousands of victims displayed simultaneously as rotting warnings to anyone who might consider opposing his rule. Foreign ambassadors wrote home describing the stench of decomposing bodies that hung over Wallachia like a permanent cloud, visible from miles away and serving as a constant reminder of what happened to those who displeased their prince. The most psychologically disturbing aspect of Vlad's reign was how he seemed to derive genuine personal pleasure from overseeing torture and execution. Unlike other cruel rulers who delegated such tasks to subordinates, Vlad insisted on being present for every impalement, often positioning himself where he could observe his victims' faces as they died. Contemporary accounts describe him dining outdoors among freshly impaled prisoners, apparently finding his meals more enjoyable when accompanied by the screams of the dying. This wasn't simply political terrorism, though it certainly served that function. Vlad appeared to require the sight and sound of human suffering for his own psychological satisfaction. He would invite foreign diplomats to join him for these grotesque banquets, watching their reactions with evident amusement as they struggled to maintain diplomatic composure while surrounded by torture and death. Vlad's systematic cruelty extended beyond political enemies to encompass anyone who fell short of his standards for social order. In 1459, he invited all the beggars, sick, and disabled people in his capital to a great feast, promising them food and shelter in celebration of a religious holiday. When several hundred of society's most vulnerable people had gathered in a large hall, Vlad had the building set on fire, burning alive hundreds of individuals whose only crime was poverty or illness. His justification for this mass murder revealed the grandiose delusions that had come to dominate his thinking. Vlad claimed that by eliminating the poor and sick, he was purifying Wallachia of sin and weakness, creating a stronger society that would be better able to resist foreign enemies. This wasn't conventional medieval charity or even typical royal indifference to suffering. It was systematic genocide carried out under the guise of social improvement. Vlad's sexual practices were equally horrifying and revealed the same need for violence and terror that characterized all his personal relationships. Unlike other medieval rulers whose violations of women were driven primarily by lust or desire for dominance, Vlad seemed to require brutality and fear to achieve any form of sexual satisfaction. Multiple contemporary sources describe how he would force noble families to provide daughters for his pleasure, then have the women tortured to death while their relatives watched from captivity. The psychological torture of the victims' families appeared to be as important to him as the physical violation of the women themselves. He would often keep parents or siblings imprisoned specifically so they could witness the prolonged suffering of their loved ones, apparently finding their anguish as stimulating as the sexual acts he was performing. One particularly disturbing account from 1460 describes Vlad's treatment of captured Ottoman soldiers during one of his many conflicts with the empire. Rather than simply executing them as prisoners of war according to established medieval custom, he had them slowly skinned alive while forcing their surviving comrades to watch. Those who survived the skinning process were then impaled, creating a deliberate progression of horror designed to break the psychological resistance of subsequent captives. This systematic approach to psychological warfare represented something new in medieval military practice. While torture and execution of prisoners had always been part of warfare, Vlad's methods were specifically designed to create lasting trauma that would spread beyond immediate victims to their families, communities, and entire cultures. He was waging war not just against enemy soldiers, but against the mental health of entire populations. Vlad's reign reached its most notorious peak during his major conflict with the Ottoman Empire in the 1460s. When Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, invaded Wallachia with a massive army, Vlad responded not with conventional military tactics, but with a campaign of pure psychological terrorism that became legendary throughout Europe and the Islamic world. He retreated ahead of the Ottoman advance, leaving behind a landscape deliberately designed to break the morale of pursuing forces. Every village was burned, every well was poisoned with rotting corpses, and every crossroads was decorated with forests of impaled prisoners. The psychological impact was so severe that the Sultan's army, despite vastly outnumbering Vlad's forces, eventually withdrew rather than continue pursuing him through this hellscape of deliberate horror. The most famous incident of this campaign occurred when Vlad created a forest of 20,000 impaled Ottoman prisoners outside the city of Târgoviște. Contemporary accounts describe a scene so horrific that Sultan Mehmed himself, a man hardened by decades of warfare and conquest, reportedly turned back rather than enter the city. Ottoman chroniclers wrote of soldiers weeping and vomiting at the sight, with some deserting rather than continue the campaign through what they described as hell on earth. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Vlad's character was his apparent belief that his cruelties were justified by religious and moral purposes. He consistently claimed that his mass killings and systematic torture were necessary to purge Wallachia of corruption and sin, casting himself as an instrument of divine justice, carrying out God's will on earth. This grandiose self-image allowed him to escalate his violence without psychological limit, since any act, no matter how brutal, could be rationalized as serving a higher spiritual purpose. Vlad had created a theological framework that transformed sadistic pleasure into religious duty, making his cruelty literally boundless in scope and intensity. His personal relationships reflected this complete inability to form normal human emotional connections. His marriage to a Hungarian noblewoman was reportedly marked by constant terror on her part and cruel psychological manipulation on his. When she finally attempted to escape his control by throwing herself from a castle tower, Vlad showed no grief or remorse, but instead seemed amused by what he called her weakness and lack of faith in his divine mission. Vlad's treatment of his own children, when he had any, followed the same pattern of emotional manipulation and casual cruelty that marked all his relationships. He seemed incapable of understanding love, loyalty, or trust as anything other than tools for controlling others, leaving even his closest family members in constant fear of his unpredictable violence. The end of Vlad's reign came in 1476 when he was assassinated by his own nobles during a battle with Ottoman forces. His death was met with relief throughout Eastern Europe, but the psychological scars of his rule lasted for generations. Wallachia remained associated with supernatural horror and extreme violence in the European imagination long after his death, contributing to the region's reputation as a land where normal human values didn't apply. Vlad the Impaler represents perhaps the purest example of medieval royal sadism taken to its logical extreme. Unlike other cruel rulers whose violence served recognizable political purposes, Vlad's cruelty appeared to exist primarily for its own sake, feeding on itself until it consumed everything around him. His reign demonstrated what could happen when absolute power was wielded by someone who had lost all capacity for normal human empathy. The legend of Dracula that eventually grew from Vlad's historical reputation captures something essential about his character: the image of a figure who feeds on human suffering, who cannot exist without causing pain, and who transforms everything he touches into a reflection of his own psychological darkness. In this sense, the vampire myth may represent history's most accurate metaphor for what unchecked absolute power can become when placed in the hands of a genuinely disturbed mind. Our journey through medieval royal depravity culminates with Henry VIII of England, whose reign from 1509 to 1547 transformed royal marriage from a sacred institution into a machinery of legal murder. While technically at the end of the medieval period, Henry's behavior represents the logical conclusion of centuries of royal excess, showing what happened when medieval concepts of absolute authority collided with Renaissance political sophistication and personal psychology. Henry's transformation from the golden prince of European Renaissance culture into a wife-killing tyrant represents one of history's most dramatic examples of how power can corrupt even seemingly admirable individuals. The young king who ascended the throne at 18 was physically imposing, highly educated, artistically talented, and apparently devoted to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Yet within 30 years, he had created a new national church, redefined English law, and established the precedent that queens could be legally murdered for failing to satisfy their husbands' demands. The psychological roots of Henry's eventual monstrous behavior can be traced to his obsession with male succession and divine validation of his rule. Unlike many medieval kings who accepted that royal bloodlines sometimes passed through daughters, Henry convinced himself that God specifically required him to produce a legitimate son as proof of divine approval for his reign. This belief would eventually justify any level of cruelty in pursuit of male heirs. When Catherine of Aragon failed to provide the required son after nearly 20 years of marriage, Henry's disappointment gradually transformed into something far more dangerous: a conviction that he was morally justified in destroying anyone who stood between him and his dynastic goals. This wasn't simply political calculation, but a genuine belief that his personal desires aligned perfectly with God's will for England. His pursuit of Anne Boleyn revealed the calculating patience that would characterize his later relationships with women. Henry courted Anne for nearly 7 years, using every resource of the crown to pressure her into his bed while simultaneously working to annul his marriage to Catherine. When Anne continued to resist his advances, demanding marriage rather than concubinage, Henry proved willing to tear apart the English church, defy the Pope, and risk civil war rather than accept sexual rejection from any woman. But Henry's treatment of Anne after their marriage demonstrated how quickly his passionate pursuit could transform into cold manipulation and eventual murderous intent. The man who had moved heaven and earth to possess her became utterly indifferent to her welfare as soon as she failed to produce the male heir he demanded. When Anne miscarried their second child in 1536, Henry immediately began planning her destruction. The fabrication of charges against Anne Boleyn established a legal and psychological template that Henry would use repeatedly throughout his reign. He created impossible standards for queenly behavior, then retroactively criminalized anything that could be construed as falling short of these expectations. Anne was accused of committing adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother, on dates when court records clearly showed she was either pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or physically separated from her alleged lovers. The evidence against Anne was so transparently fabricated that even Henry's own advisors privately acknowledged its absurdity. Yet the king's manipulation of English law and legal procedure was so skillful that Anne was convicted and executed, establishing the precedent that royal wives served entirely at their husband's pleasure and could be eliminated through judicial murder whenever they became politically or personally inconvenient. This wasn't simply tyranny in the conventional medieval sense, but something more systematic: the deliberate destruction of any legal or moral constraint on royal behavior toward women. Henry had essentially legalized wife murder by clothing it in the forms of legal procedure and religious justification. Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, died in childbirth, 13 days after finally providing the male heir Henry had demanded for so many years. Even this tragedy revealed Henry's fundamental incapacity for normal human emotion. Rather than mourning Jane's sacrifice, Henry seemed primarily pleased that she had validated his belief in his divine destiny by producing Prince Edward. When courtiers attempted to console him on his loss, he reportedly dismissed their sympathy, claiming that God had finally rewarded his patience and faithfulness. The speed with which Henry moved to find a fourth wife after Jane's death demonstrated how completely he had reduced royal marriage to a mechanical process designed to serve his political and personal needs. Within months of Jane's funeral, he was negotiating for Anne of Cleves, a German princess chosen primarily for her potential value in European diplomatic alliances. When political circumstances made the marriage to Anne of Cleves inconvenient, Henry's response revealed how thoroughly he had abandoned any pretense of treating wives as human beings, rather than disposable political assets. He simply declared that Anne was too physically repulsive for him to consummate their marriage, then forced her to agree to an annulment by implicitly threatening her with the same judicial murder that had destroyed Anne Boleyn. Anne of Cleves, demonstrating remarkable intelligence and survival instinct, agreed to the divorce and accepted a comfortable exile rather than risk challenging Henry's increasingly arbitrary and violent behavior toward wives who displeased him. Her survival earned her the historical nickname of the luckiest of Henry's wives, a designation that speaks volumes about what marriage to Henry VIII normally entailed. But it was Henry's treatment of his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, that most clearly revealed the depths of his psychological cruelty and his complete abandonment of any moral restraint in his relationships with women. Catherine was approximately 19 when Henry married her, a young woman whose previous romantic experiences had been entirely normal teenage relationships, appropriate for someone of her age and social background. Henry, now in his 50s and grotesquely obese, apparently convinced himself that his young wife should feel nothing but gratitude for his attention and absolute devotion to him alone. When evidence emerged of Catherine's premarital relationships, Henry's reaction was so extreme that even his violence-hardened courtiers were genuinely shocked by his vindictive cruelty. Rather than simply ordering Catherine's execution, Henry created new laws specifically designed to maximize her psychological suffering before death. He made it retroactively treasonous for an unchaste woman to marry the king without revealing her complete sexual history, then applied this law to criminalize Catherine's failure to confess relationships that had occurred years before she ever met Henry. The process of destroying Catherine Howard was deliberately extended over many months to increase her mental torment. Henry had her confined to her chambers while investigators subjected her to repeated interrogations about every intimate detail of her teenage relationships. He forced her to provide written confessions of her sexual experiences, then used these documents to publicly humiliate her before her eventual execution. Henry's final wife, Catherine Parr, survived only by demonstrating complete intellectual and emotional submission to his increasingly paranoid and violent personality. She lived in constant awareness that any word or action that could be interpreted as criticism or independence might result in the same judicial murder that had destroyed Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. The psychological impact of Henry's systematic brutalization of wives extended far beyond his immediate victims to affect English society as a whole. Noble families became reluctant to offer daughters for royal marriages, understanding that proximity to Henry's favor was more likely to result in death than honor. The king's treatment of queens sent a clear message about how all English women could expect to be treated by men with power over them. Henry's later years were marked by increasing physical decay and psychological instability that made him dangerous to everyone around him, not just his wives. His courtiers lived in constant fear, never knowing whether they would face the jovial king who had once been the flower of Renaissance monarchy, or the paranoid tyrant who saw enemies and betrayal in every gesture or conversation. The king's final months were consumed by pain from infected leg wounds that refused to heal, possibly complicated by diabetes and other conditions related to his extreme obesity. But rather than mellowing his temperament, physical suffering seemed to intensify his cruelty and suspicion. He continued planning new marriages and executions almost until the moment of his death in 1547. Henry VIII's reign represents the culmination of medieval royal excess, demonstrating how absolute power could be used to transform even fundamental human relationships into instruments of control and violence. His systematic destruction of 6 marriages through divorce, annulment, and judicial murder established precedents for royal behavior that would influence English monarchy for generations. More broadly, Henry's story shows how medieval concepts of divine kingship and absolute authority could be weaponized by Renaissance political techniques to create new forms of systematic oppression. His reign marked the end of any meaningful constraint on royal power over individual subjects, particularly women, and established the principle that law itself could be manipulated to justify any level of personal cruelty. The legacy of Henry's marriages extended far beyond England to influence European attitudes toward royal power and the treatment of women throughout the early modern period. His example encouraged other monarchs to believe that their personal desires, no matter how destructive or immoral, could be transformed into matters of state policy and divine mandate. As our journey through the darkest corners of medieval monarchy draws to a close, we must consider what these stories tell us about power, human nature, and the societies that created and enabled such monstrous behavior. The kings we've encountered tonight weren't aberrations or exceptions. They were the logical products of a political system that placed no meaningful constraints on royal behavior while providing every incentive for excess and cruelty. Medieval kingship was built on the fundamental premise that monarchs were divinely appointed and therefore above ordinary moral law. This theological foundation, combined with the practical reality of absolute power over life and death, created conditions where disturbed personalities could flourish without meaningful opposition or correction. The very structure of medieval monarchy selected for individuals who were comfortable exercising ultimate authority over other human beings. The enabling mechanisms that allowed these rulers to commit their atrocities were systematic and institutional rather than merely personal. Courts filled with sycophants and dependents who couldn't afford to criticize royal behavior, legal systems designed to serve royal convenience rather than justice, and religious establishments that provided theological justification for any action taken by God's anointed representatives on earth. Perhaps most disturbing is how these monarchs' subjects often participated willingly in their rulers' cruelties, either through active collaboration or passive acceptance. The same nobles who might privately deplore a king's treatment of women would publicly attend executions and applaud judicial murders when their own interests weren't directly threatened. Medieval society had developed elaborate mechanisms for normalizing and justifying even the most extreme royal behavior. The psychological profiles that emerge from these historical accounts share disturbing similarities: grandiose self-regard, inability to empathize with others' suffering, need for absolute control over personal relationships, and tendency to interpret any resistance as personal betrayal, deserving extreme punishment. These weren't simply cruel men who happened to be kings, but individuals whose personalities were fundamentally shaped by the experience of wielding unlimited power from early ages. The impact of royal depravity extended far beyond immediate victims to affect entire societies. When kings routinely violated the most basic moral and legal norms, it created cultures where violence and exploitation became accepted parts of daily life. The example set by monarchs influenced the behavior of nobles, administrators, and eventually ordinary citizens, creating cascading cycles of abuse and brutalization. Women, as the most vulnerable targets of royal excess, suffered disproportionately under systems that treated them as property to be possessed, used, and discarded according to male convenience. But the damage wasn't limited to direct victims. The normalization of violence against women by the highest authorities in the land sent messages about female value and male prerogatives that influenced gender relations throughout society. The religious dimensions of royal depravity deserve special attention. These kings didn't generally see themselves as opponents of Christianity, but as its most faithful servants carrying out divine will. Their ability to transform personal cruelty into religious duty demonstrates how theological concepts can be manipulated to justify any level of human suffering when combined with absolute political power. The legal innovations created by these monarchs to justify their behavior had lasting institutional impacts that extended far beyond their individual reigns. Henry VIII's redefinition of treason to include disappointing royal expectations, Ivan the Terrible's use of law enforcement as systematic terrorism, and Vlad the Impaler's transformation of justice into public entertainment all established precedents that influenced their respective legal systems for centuries. Economic factors also played crucial roles in enabling royal depravity. Medieval monarchs controlled vast resources that allowed them to maintain elaborate systems of surveillance, punishment, and reward designed to ensure compliance with their demands. The concentration of wealth in royal hands meant that opposing a king's behavior, no matter how outrageous, could result in complete economic destruction for entire families and regions. The international dimensions of medieval royal behavior created diplomatic and military complications that often had devastating consequences for ordinary people. When kings like John of England or Philip Augustus of France allowed personal obsessions to dictate foreign policy, the resulting conflicts produced suffering on scales that dwarfed their individual cruelties. Yet perhaps the most important lesson from these historical accounts is how quickly seemingly civilized societies could adapt to extreme brutality when it was presented as legitimate royal authority. The same populations that produced magnificent art, literature, and architecture also provided enthusiastic audiences for public executions and mass torture sessions. This adaptability suggests something deeply troubling about human nature and social organization. When authority figures model and reward cruel behavior, entire populations can apparently learn to find entertainment and even moral satisfaction in others' suffering. The medieval period demonstrates that civilization is far more fragile than we often assume. The eventual decline of medieval monarchy didn't occur because rulers suddenly became more moral or populations more enlightened, but because changing economic and military conditions made absolute royal power less sustainable. The rise of merchant classes, professional armies, and competing centers of authority gradually eroded the foundations that had supported unlimited royal prerogatives. However, the psychological and cultural patterns established during centuries of medieval royal excess didn't disappear with constitutional monarchy. Modern history has repeatedly demonstrated that the same combinations of absolute power, ideological justification, and popular compliance that enabled medieval royal depravity can resurface in different political forms with equally devastating results. The study of medieval royal depravity therefore serves not just as historical curiosity, but as a warning about the permanent potential for human societies to enable and normalize extreme cruelty when proper institutional constraints and moral education are absent. These stories remind us that civilization requires constant vigilance and deliberate effort to maintain. While technically preceding the medieval period, no discussion of royal depravity would be complete without examining Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, whose brief reign from 37 to 41 CE established templates for imperial excess that would influence monarchs for centuries. His 4-year rule demonstrated how quickly absolute power could transform even a promising young ruler into something that challenged the very boundaries of human behavior. Caligula's early life seemed to promise greatness rather than infamy. Born into the imperial family, he spent his childhood among the legions on the Germanic frontier, where soldiers nicknamed him Little Boots for the miniature military sandals he wore. The young prince was beloved by the troops and appeared to embody the martial virtues that Romans admired most. When he succeeded his great-uncle Tiberius as emperor, the Roman people celebrated what they expected to be a return to the golden days of Augustus. The first months of Caligula's reign seemed to justify this optimism. He freed political prisoners, restored popular elections, and distributed generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard and Roman citizens. But this promising beginning masked psychological instabilities that would soon transform the Roman Empire into a theater of unimaginable cruelty and sexual excess. The change began after Caligula suffered a severe illness in late 37, possibly encephalitis or another condition affecting his brain. When he recovered, those closest to him noticed disturbing alterations in his personality. The young man who had shown promise as a conventional ruler began displaying behaviors that shocked even the jaded Roman aristocracy. Caligula's sexual appetites became legendary throughout the ancient world for their scope and complete disregard for any moral or legal boundaries. He began systematically exploiting the wives of senators and other high-ranking officials through abuse of power, often forcing their husbands to attend these violations as unwilling witnesses. But unlike other rulers whose sexual violence seemed motivated by lust or political dominance, Caligula appeared driven by a desire to demonstrate his complete power over every aspect of Roman society. His treatment of his own sisters crossed boundaries that even the morally flexible Roman elite found shocking. Caligula engaged in scandalous and morally shocking relationships with his sisters, but reserved special attention for Drusilla, whom he treated as if she were his wife rather than his sibling. He appeared with her at public events, showered her with honors typically reserved for empresses, and reportedly planned to name her as his heir, completely bypassing the male members of the imperial family. When Drusilla died in 38, Caligula's grief took forms that revealed the depth of his psychological disturbance. He declared her a goddess and established a cult devoted to her worship, complete with temples and priestesses. More disturbing, he reportedly had her body preserved and would speak to her corpse as if she were still alive, asking for her advice on imperial matters and becoming agitated when she didn't respond. Caligula's belief in his own divinity, which began as what might have been political theater, gradually consumed his entire personality. He began appearing in public, dressed as various gods, commissioned statues of himself with divine attributes, and demanded that all Roman citizens worship him as a living deity. This wasn't merely the conventional emperor cult that had developed under Augustus, but something far more psychologically disturbed. The emperor began constructing elaborate sexual scenarios that combined his divine delusions with his need for complete dominance over others. He would dress as gods like Jupiter or Neptune while engaging in acts of rape and torture, apparently believing that his divine status justified any behavior, no matter how cruel or depraved. These sessions often took place in temples or other sacred spaces, adding sacrilege to sexual violence. One of the most notorious examples of Caligula's sexual cruelty involved his treatment of Caesonia, a woman who eventually became his fourth wife. Rather than courting her in conventional fashion, Caligula seized her from her husband, subjected her to humiliating abuse, then kept her under his control for months before deciding to marry her. Even after their marriage, he would loan her to other men for his entertainment, apparently finding pleasure in her humiliation and degradation. Caligula's approach to marriage itself demonstrated his complete rejection of normal human relationships. He married and divorced wives apparently at random, sometimes for reasons as trivial as finding their conversation boring or disliking their appearance in certain lighting. One wife was reportedly divorced on their wedding day because Caligula decided she looked too happy, which he interpreted as insufficiently awed by his divine presence. The emperor's sexual violence extended beyond his immediate circle to encompass any woman who caught his attention throughout the Roman Empire. He would order governors to send him the wives and daughters of prominent citizens for his pleasure, treating these kidnappings as legitimate exercises of imperial authority. The psychological impact on families throughout the empire was devastating, as no one could feel safe from the emperor's arbitrary desires. But perhaps most disturbing was how Caligula weaponized sexuality as a tool of political control. He would force senators to pimp their own wives and daughters to him, requiring them to negotiate prices and arrange schedules as if they were running brothels. This wasn't simply sexual exploitation, but a systematic method of destroying the dignity and self-respect of the Roman aristocracy. The emperor's cruelties reached their peak during gladiatorial games and public spectacles, which he transformed into opportunities for mass sexual violence. He subjected condemned criminals to horrifying spectacles involving wild animals in the arena, ordered mass orgies involving slaves and prisoners, and forced prominent citizens to participate in degrading sexual acts as public entertainment. Caligula's reign of sexual terror was brought to an end in 41 when a group of Praetorian guards, led by Cassius Chaerea, assassinated him in a tunnel beneath the imperial palace. The conspiracy included senators, military officers, and even some of his own freedmen, demonstrating how completely he had alienated every segment of Roman society. The aftermath of Caligula's assassination revealed the lasting damage his reign had inflicted on Roman political culture. The Senate seriously considered restoring the Republic rather than risk another imperial monster, while the Praetorian Guard's role in choosing emperors was permanently established. Most significantly, the precedents Caligula set for imperial sexual behavior would influence his successors for centuries. Following Caligula's template for imperial excess, Marcus Aurelius Commodus ruled Rome from 180 to 192 CE, transforming the empire into his personal playground of violence and sexual depravity. While his father Marcus Aurelius had been a philosopher-emperor who embodied Stoic virtues, Commodus represented the complete corruption of imperial power when placed in the hands of someone who viewed cruelty as entertainment. Unlike Caligula, whose madness seemed to develop suddenly after illness, Commodus displayed disturbing tendencies from early childhood that should have warned observers about his unsuitability for power. Even as a young prince, he showed unusual pleasure in watching gladiatorial combat and public executions, often becoming visibly excited by displays of violence and death. When Commodus became emperor at 18, he immediately began transforming the imperial court into a venue for increasingly elaborate sexual and violent spectacles. He commissioned the construction of private arenas within the palace complex where he could stage gladiatorial contests, wild animal hunts, and mass executions for his personal entertainment and that of carefully selected guests. But Commodus's appetites extended beyond mere spectatorship. He began participating directly in gladiatorial combat, though under conditions that guaranteed his victory and safety. These weren't fair contests, but elaborate theatrical productions designed to showcase the emperor's supposed prowess while satisfying his need for violence and public adoration. The emperor's sexual practices became intertwined with his love of violence in ways that horrified even the morally flexible Roman aristocracy. He maintained a private circle of gladiators and companions, chosen for their ability to endure harsh treatment, blending violence with personal indulgence. These relationships weren't based on affection or even lust, but on Commodus's need to dominate individuals who represented physical strength and courage. Commodus's treatment of his concubines revealed the sadistic nature of his sexuality. He forced them into brutal contests, sometimes fatal, using the survivors to feed his twisted sense of power and indulgence. These contests weren't simply entertainment, but elaborate foreplay that combined sexual arousal with violence and death. The emperor's marriage to Brutia Crispina demonstrated how his violent appetites corrupted even supposedly normal relationships. Rather than treating her as an empress, Commodus subjected his wife to constant humiliation and abuse, forcing her to watch his sexual encounters with others and participate in degrading spectacles designed to break her spirit. When Crispina was eventually accused of adultery, likely on fabricated charges, Commodus's response revealed the depths of his cruelty. Rather than simply ordering her execution, he had her exiled to the island of Capri, where she was subjected to elaborate tortures designed to extend her suffering for months before her eventual death. Commodus's reign reached its nadir with his decision to rename Rome itself in his honor, calling the city Colonia Commodiana. This wasn't merely megalomania, but part of a comprehensive program to remake Roman society according to his violent fantasies. He renamed the months of the year after his various titles, required all citizens to participate in gladiatorial training, and established new festivals devoted to celebrating violence and sexual excess. The emperor's final years were marked by increasing paranoia and violence as he began to suspect conspiracies everywhere. His response was to intensify his reign of terror, ordering mass executions based on the flimsiest evidence and transforming the imperial court into a place where survival depended entirely on the emperor's momentary whims. Commodus met his end in 192 when he was assassinated by a conspiracy that included his concubine Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Latus. Significantly, the plot was motivated not by political ideology, but by the conspirators' fear that they would eventually become victims of the emperor's increasingly arbitrary violence. Our earlier exploration of King John's reign only scratched the surface of his systematic sexual predation and political cruelty. Deeper examination of contemporary chronicles reveals additional patterns of behavior that demonstrate how completely he had abandoned any pretense of moral restraint in his treatment of subjects. One of the most disturbing aspects of John's reign was his use of hostages, particularly female hostages, as instruments of both political control and personal gratification. Medieval warfare commonly involved taking hostages to ensure compliance with treaties, but John perverted this custom into a system for acquiring victims for his sexual appetites. When John captured enemy castles or forced rebellious nobles into submission, he would routinely demand their female relatives as guarantees of future loyalty. These hostages were drawn from noble families to middle age, would be brought to royal residences where they effectively disappeared from historical record. Their fates unknown but easily imagined given John's established patterns of behavior. The systematic nature of John's hostage-taking suggests careful planning rather than impulsive cruelty. Royal records show that he maintained detailed inventories of female hostages, noting their family connections, ages, and political value. This wasn't random predation, but calculated exploitation designed to maximize both political control and personal pleasure. Contemporary accounts also reveal John's practice of using marriage negotiations as opportunities for sexual assault. When foreign princes or nobles sought marriages with English noblewomen, John would insist on personally inspecting the proposed brides, often keeping them at court for extended periods during which they were subjected to mistreatment and exploitation. These false marriage negotiations served multiple purposes for John. They provided him with victims under the pretense of legitimate royal business. They allowed him to humiliate rival nobles by violating their female relatives, and they created diplomatic chaos that he could exploit for political advantage. The psychological impact of John's behavior on noble families throughout England was devastating and long-lasting. Many families began refusing to send their daughters to court for any reason, preferring to forfeit royal favor rather than risk their loved one's safety. This widespread fear created a climate of suspicion and hostility that undermined John's ability to govern effectively. John's treatment of religious women was particularly shocking even by medieval standards. His violations of nuns and abbesses weren't simply breaches of church law, but represented symbolic attacks on the entire structure of medieval Christian society. By targeting women who had dedicated their lives to God, John was demonstrating his belief that no person or institution could limit his power. The political consequences of John's sexual violence extended far beyond England's borders. His reputation for predatory behavior made diplomatic marriages almost impossible to arrange, depriving England of crucial European alliances. Foreign nobles were reluctant to negotiate with a king they couldn't trust to respect even the most basic social conventions. Perhaps most significantly, John's behavior established precedents for royal conduct that would influence English monarchy for generations. His systematic use of sexual violence as a tool of political control, his willingness to violate church sanctuary, and his complete disregard for established marriage customs all expanded the boundaries of what kings could do with impunity. Our earlier examination of Edward II's reign focused primarily on his relationships with Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, but the full scope of his personal and political failures reveals a more complex pattern of dysfunction that extended far beyond his famous male favorites. Edward's inability to distinguish between private desire and public duty manifested in numerous ways beyond his well-documented relationships. He surrounded himself with an entire court of young men chosen primarily for their physical attractiveness rather than their political competence, creating an atmosphere that scandalized even the relatively tolerant medieval nobility. Contemporary accounts describe royal banquets, where Edward would openly fondle his favorites while conducting state business, apparently oblivious to the political damage such displays were causing. Foreign ambassadors wrote home describing scenes that seemed more appropriate to a brothel than a royal court, with the King of England behaving in ways that undermined his authority and dignity. The financial cost of Edward's favorites extended far beyond the gifts and titles he lavished on individuals like Gaveston and Despenser. He maintained an elaborate court household designed primarily to accommodate his personal pleasures, employing hundreds of servants, entertainers, and companions whose only qualifications were their ability to amuse or attract the king. These expenditures came at a time when England faced serious military and economic challenges that required focused royal attention and careful resource management. Instead, Edward was bankrupting the royal treasury to fund what amounted to an elaborate male harem disguised as a royal court. Edward's neglect of his wife Isabella extended beyond simple marital indifference to active cruelty designed to humiliate her before the entire European nobility. He would force her to attend celebrations honoring his male favorites, require her to show public deference to men who were openly sleeping with her husband, and subject her to various forms of psychological torture designed to break her spirit. Isabella's eventual rebellion wasn't simply political opportunism, but the desperate act of a woman who had endured years of systematic humiliation and abuse. Her affair with Roger Mortimer represented both personal liberation and political necessity, giving her the emotional strength and military support needed to challenge Edward's destructive rule. The broader impact of Edward's reign on English political culture was profound and lasting. His complete subordination of royal duty to personal pleasure established dangerous precedents for how monarchs could behave while still maintaining theoretical legitimacy. Future kings would remember that Edward had gotten away with years of outrageous conduct before finally facing consequences. Edward's death in Berkeley Castle, whether by murder or natural causes, became a symbol of the ultimate price of royal self-indulgence. The king who had believed his personal desires justified any political cost died alone and abandoned, a cautionary tale about the limits of absolute power when exercised without wisdom or restraint. The psychological patterns that dominated Philip Augustus's reign deserve deeper examination, as they reveal how personal trauma and obsessive tendencies could distort the judgment of even politically successful monarchs. Philip's achievements in expanding French territory and strengthening royal authority came at enormous personal cost to himself and those around him. Philip's obsession with Isabella of Hainaut appears to have roots in his childhood experiences of political instability and family dysfunction. Crowned at age 15 after his father's death, Philip grew up in a court where political marriages were routinely dissolved, where loyalty was temporary, and where emotional attachments were seen as dangerous vulnerabilities. His intense focus on Isabella may have represented an attempt to create the stable, loving relationship that had been absent from his childhood. But his complete inability to accept normal marital boundaries transformed what might have been genuine affection into a suffocating possessiveness that ultimately destroyed the very relationship he was trying to preserve. Contemporary accounts describe Philip's daily routine during his marriage to Isabella as revolving entirely around monitoring and controlling her activities. He would question servants about her conversations, examine her correspondence, and fly into rages when she showed interest in anything or anyone besides himself. This wasn't love, but a form of psychological imprisonment. Philip's treatment of Ingeborg of Denmark reveals the depths of his emotional instability when his fantasies collided with reality. His immediate and extreme rejection of his second wife suggests that he had created impossible expectations based on his idealized memories of Isabella, then punished Ingeborg for failing to match these fantasies. The 20-year battle over his marriage to Ingeborg wasn't simply a diplomatic dispute, but a manifestation of Philip's complete inability to accept that other people had independent wills and desires. His willingness to see his entire kingdom suffer under papal interdict rather than compromise on his marital situation demonstrates how completely his personal obsessions had overwhelmed his political judgment. Philip's relationship with his son Louis reveals similar patterns of obsessive control extending to his role as father. Unable to accept that his heir might develop independent thoughts and relationships, Philip subjected the young prince to surveillance and manipulation that may have contributed to Louis's premature death. The broader impact of Philip's psychological disorders on French political culture was significant. His treatment of queens established precedents for royal marriage that emphasized complete submission and absolute control, patterns that would influence French monarchy for generations. The full scope of Ivan the Terrible's reign of terror extends far beyond the individual atrocities we've already examined. Contemporary Russian and foreign sources reveal a systematic program of psychological warfare designed to break the spirit of his entire empire and transform Russia into a reflection of his own disturbed psyche. Ivan's creation of the oprichniki, his personal guard unit, represents one of history's most sophisticated experiments in state-sponsored terrorism. These black-clad horsemen who carried dogs' heads and brooms as symbols of their mission to sniff out and sweep away treason, operated outside all legal constraints and answered only to Ivan's personal commands. The oprichniki weren't simply elite soldiers or police officers, but participants in what amounted to a religious cult devoted to Ivan's worship. They took special oaths of loyalty that superseded all other obligations, including family bonds and Christian morality, effectively transforming them into extensions of Ivan's will rather than independent human beings. Ivan used the oprichniki to conduct experiments in large-scale psychological manipulation that went far beyond conventional military or political repression. They would surround entire towns, separate families from each other, then subject the populations to elaborate rituals of humiliation and terror designed to break community bonds and create total dependence on Ivan's mercy. These operations often involved compelling families to endure or witness acts of cruelty that tore them apart emotionally, requiring spouses to choose which partner would die first, or compelling religious leaders to desecrate their own churches. The goal wasn't simply to punish suspected disloyalty, but to destroy the psychological foundations of social cohesion throughout Russia. Ivan's treatment of prisoners during his various military campaigns revealed similar patterns of systematic cruelty designed to create lasting psychological trauma. Rather than simply executing captured enemies, he subjected them to prolonged and cruel punishments intended to break their spirit that forced them to experience maximum pain while remaining conscious for as long as possible. Contemporary accounts describe Ivan personally overseeing torture sessions that could last for days, with the Tsar apparently deriving genuine pleasure from his victims' suffering while also taking detailed notes about their responses to different forms of pain. This wasn't sadism in the conventional sense, but something approaching scientific experimentation with human agony. The religious dimensions of Ivan's cruelty deserve special attention, as he consistently claimed divine authorization for his most heinous acts. He surrounded himself with corrupted monks and priests who provided theological justification for any level of brutality, creating a perverted form of Orthodox Christianity that transformed murder and torture into acts of worship. Ivan's later years were marked by increasingly elaborate rituals of penance and atonement that alternated with periods of unprecedented violence. He would spend weeks in monasteries, fasting and praying for forgiveness for his sins, then emerged to commit new atrocities that exceeded everything he had done before. These cycles suggest a form of psychological addiction to violence that was beyond his conscious control. The impact of Ivan's reign on Russian political culture proved lasting and profound. His techniques of governance through terror, his systematic destruction of traditional social bonds, and his transformation of religious authority into an instrument of oppression all became permanent features of Russian statecraft that would influence the country for centuries. The monarchs we've examined tonight didn't operate in isolation, but created institutional systems that outlived their individual reigns and influenced political development across Europe for centuries. Their innovations in the systematic application of cruelty, the manipulation of law and religion to justify personal excess, and the creation of court cultures that normalized extreme behavior all became part of the permanent legacy of medieval monarchy. The legal precedents established by rulers like Henry VIII and Ivan the Terrible fundamentally altered the relationship between monarchs and subjects throughout Europe. Henry's redefinition of treason to include any behavior that disappointed royal expectations created a legal framework that made criticism of royal conduct potentially fatal, while Ivan's use of law enforcement as systematic terrorism established the principle that legal systems could be weaponized for political control. These legal innovations weren't simply temporary expedients that died with their creators, but became embedded in the institutional structures of monarchy itself. Future rulers inherited not just thrones and treasuries, but legal frameworks that made extreme royal behavior technically legal and practically unstoppable. The religious dimensions of royal depravity also had lasting institutional consequences. When monarchs like Philip Augustus and Ivan the Terrible successfully corrupted church authorities into providing theological justification for their cruelties, they established precedents for the subordination of religious authority to political power that would influence European Christianity for generations. The court cultures created by these depraved monarchs proved particularly influential in shaping aristocratic behavior throughout Europe. When kings made cruelty fashionable, when royal favor depended on participation in or tolerance for extreme behavior, and when survival required complicity in atrocities, entire noble classes learned to normalize and even celebrate brutality. These cultural changes didn't disappear when individual tyrants died, but became part of the social fabric of European aristocracy. The casual cruelty, the systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations, and the complete disregard for moral constraints that characterized medieval royal courts all became standard features of elite behavior that persisted well into the modern period. The economic systems that supported royal excess also created lasting institutional legacies. The concentration of wealth and resources necessary to maintain elaborate systems of surveillance, punishment, and reward required fundamental changes in how medieval societies organized labor, taxation, and resource distribution. These economic transformations, initially designed to support individual monarchs' appetites for luxury and control, eventually became permanent features of European political economy that outlasted the specific rulers who created them. The centralized administrative systems, the professional bureaucracies, and the standing armies that enabled royal tyranny all became essential components of modern state power. Perhaps most significantly, the psychological techniques pioneered by medieval tyrants established templates for political control that would be studied and refined by later authoritarian movements. The use of unpredictable violence to create submission, the systematic destruction of social bonds to prevent collective resistance, and the manipulation of ideology to justify any level of cruelty all became standard tools of oppressive governance. The international dimensions of royal depravity also had lasting consequences for European diplomatic and military culture. When kings routinely violated the most basic moral and legal norms in their treatment of subjects, it created precedents for similar behavior in international relations that contributed to centuries of warfare and diplomatic instability. The normalization of extreme behavior by royal example influenced not just immediate court cultures, but entire society's understanding of what constituted acceptable conduct by authority figures. When kings demonstrated that power justified any level of cruelty, it created cascading effects throughout social hierarchies that influenced how nobles treated peasants, how husbands treated wives, and how masters treated servants. These cultural patterns proved remarkably persistent, surviving political revolutions, religious reformations, and social transformations that might have been expected to create more humane forms of authority. The psychological and institutional legacies of medieval royal depravity continued to influence European political culture well into the modern period. Understanding these long-term institutional consequences helps explain why democratic societies have found it necessary to create such elaborate systems of checks and balances, constitutional constraints, and legal protections for individual rights. The historical experience of unchecked royal power demonstrated that human beings cannot be trusted with absolute authority over others, regardless of their initial intentions or apparent qualifications. As we conclude our extended journey through the darkest chapters of medieval monarchy, we're left with profound questions about human nature, political power, and the societies we choose to build. The kings we've encountered tonight represent extreme examples of what happens when absolute authority meets psychological disturbance, but their stories illuminate patterns that remain relevant to understanding modern political and social challenges. The most striking aspect of these historical accounts may be how quickly apparently civilized societies adapted to extreme brutality when it was presented as legitimate authority. The same populations that produced magnificent cathedrals, created beautiful illuminated manuscripts, and developed sophisticated legal and theological systems also provided enthusiastic audiences for public torture and mass executions. This adaptability suggests something deeply troubling about human social psychology that extends far beyond the medieval period. When authority figures consistently model cruel behavior and reward those who participate in or enable such cruelty, entire populations can apparently learn to find entertainment and even moral satisfaction in others' suffering. Yet these dark stories also contain examples of remarkable courage and resistance that remind us of humanity's capacity for moral progress even under the most oppressive circumstances. From individual acts of defiance by victims who refused to submit silently, to organized resistance movements that eventually limited tyrannical power, to gradual cultural changes that made extreme cruelty less socially acceptable, we see evidence that moral progress is possible even in the darkest times. The institutional mechanisms that eventually constrained royal power didn't emerge spontaneously, but were created through the accumulated efforts of countless individuals who recognized that unchecked authority posed fundamental threats to human dignity and social stability. The legal protections, political institutions, and cultural norms that characterize modern democratic societies all represent responses to the historical experience of tyrannical rule. Understanding this history helps explain why vigilance in protecting democratic institutions remains essential. The human drives toward dominance and submission, the psychological vulnerabilities that make people susceptible to authoritarian appeals, and the institutional dynamics that can transform legitimate authority into oppressive tyranny all remain active in contemporary politics. The technological and economic changes that have occurred since the medieval period have created new possibilities for both human freedom and systematic oppression. While modern societies have developed more sophisticated mechanisms for constraining political power, they have also created new technologies of surveillance and control that medieval tyrants could hardly have imagined. The challenge for contemporary societies lies in harnessing these new capabilities for human flourishing while preventing their concentration in ways that might enable new forms of systematic cruelty. The historical record suggests that this requires not just formal legal protections but ongoing cultural commitment to values of human dignity, individual rights, and mutual respect. Perhaps most importantly, these stories remind us that moral progress is never guaranteed and always remains fragile. The distance between civilization and barbarism, between justice and tyranny, between compassion and cruelty, proves far smaller than we often assume. Each generation must choose anew whether to build on the moral progress of the past or allow it to decay through neglect or active destruction. The medieval monarchs we've studied tonight believed their power gave them the right to treat other human beings as objects for their pleasure and tools for their ambition. Their stories serve as permanent reminders of where such thinking leads and why societies must never stop working to ensure that power serves humanity rather than consuming it. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can find some comfort in knowing that the specific forms of royal tyranny we've explored tonight belong to the past, swept away by centuries of gradual progress toward more humane and accountable forms of governance. Yet their lessons remain relevant, offering guidance for recognizing and resisting similar patterns whenever they might emerge in new forms. The capacity for both great evil and great good lies within every human society, and the choice between them remains an active one that each generation must make. The darkness of medieval royal depravity has been replaced not by guaranteed enlightenment, but by the ongoing possibility of choosing light over darkness, justice over tyranny, compassion over cruelty. Sweet dreams, and remember that even in history's darkest chapters, the human capacity for hope, resistance, and moral progress has never been completely extinguished. The struggles of those who opposed medieval tyranny echo forward through time, inspiring each new generation to build societies worthy of human dignity and dreams.